bring in Erin, covering what will ERP cost you? Erin Costs, CEO at Site. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you. I appreciate it so much. I'll go ahead and switch my screen here. Give me just a second. Give me 1 second. We'll just make sure we get the right screen up. There we go. Lori, let me know when you can see my screen, okay, would you?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Erin. You're good to go.
Oh, excellent, excellent. Well, folks, it's great to be with you again today. We've had the opportunity to do a couple of these over the last couple of months, and we've really enjoyed ourselves. So I appreciate the interaction we've had and the other ones that we've done, and certainly Lori's support from the user community. So we've had a lot of fun. During this today, as Lori said, we're going to talk about what will ERP cost you. Just want to take a few minutes and let you know a little bit about Site Consulting Group and a little about who's on the other end of the phone, since we have not officially met. Again, my name is Erin Koss. I'm the founder and CEO at Site Consulting Group. I actually started my career running the back office for my family's fly fishing store, where I did the accounting and did my first system implementation at that time without having ever done one before. It was essentially the QuickBooks of the time. This is probably 25 years ago, or gosh, maybe a little more. From there, I got my CPA license and built an Oracle and SAP practice at a national accounting firm. When ERP became accessible to small and mid-sized companies, it was around the time we started Site Consulting Group, and it was a great opportunity to shift our focus back into the small and mid-sized market, which was not only where we were choosing to live as a family, but also just an interest and a passion of mine coming from those roots myself. So a little bit about Site Consulting Group. If you ask us what we're passionate about, we would tell you that it's investing in individuals and organizations in a way that results in quantum results, quantum leaps forward and lasting impact. So we take pretty seriously the people that we partner with on the ground, both from an organization perspective, as well as the individuals that we get to work with when we're there. We don't sell software, so we're not a traditional VAR, as many of you who have maybe NAV or GP or CRM are familiar with. We really work on the ground with clients to help augment and support the teams that are doing implementations and upgrades. And we tend to see a lot of Microsoft products for the companies that we serve. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. The people on our team today, the folks on our team, have really broad business backgrounds and business and technical backgrounds, and they've been helping companies develop enterprise solution strategies from the top down, as well as providing boots on the ground support once kind of the road trip forward or into the future begins. So I think it's because of our experience that a key strength for us is being able to really meet companies where they're at and help get them where they're trying to go. Most of our time is spent on ERP-related initiatives, because these are really kind of the sizable initiatives or change initiatives that we see when we're talking about companies making big changes from where they are today to where they're trying to go. Though in 25 years we've done just about everything, we tend to spend most of our time working with manufacturing companies, and actually in the last 10 years we've found a big focus in what we call high compliance industries, like food and beverage, consumer packaged goods, medical device, and biotech. Finally, the stuff that matters to us most when we're working with our clients is teamwork, doing the right thing, excellence, being candid and kind, and having a balanced life and work scenario in our own lives. And so this is how we run our company, and we work with our clients, and some of the things that we're passionate about and a little bit more about our experience. So with that, I want to just jump right into our presentation today by talking a little bit about the agenda and kind of the big areas that we're going to talk about today. When we talk about how to pay for ERP, I'm going to start with kind of getting us aligned on the phasing and the timing of what it is we're talking about. It will take us just a few minutes, but we'll kind of go back over some of the things we've actually talked about in prior webinars, just to kind of lay the groundwork for what we're here to talk about today. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about capitalizing versus operating expenses. For those of you who aren't in accounting, I hope this is not a big snore for you, but it's also super brief, I hope. But I do think it's some important information that we'll want to cover, particularly if we have buyers of ERP or some folks from IT on the call today. And then we'll get to the cost buckets and the estimates. So what we're hoping to do is provide you with some really hard numbers, things we've seen in the field over a number of years that might serve you, whether you're a small business or a more medium-sized business, just some ways to think about the costs and provide you some hard numbers that we've seen in the field over the last couple of years. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So we talk about ERP from our perspective and the way we're going to think about it today. We really want to talk about it in 4 phases. We're going to talk about the planning portion. We're going to talk about the selection phase, the implementation phase, as well as the optimize phase. So as we talk about the different areas today, particularly when we get to the cost and timeline section, this is kind of how we're going to break things down during our time today. So if you've joined us if you've joined us for past webinars, you know that we're really big believers in having a plan before you dive into any major change initiative, particularly ERP selection or implementation. Honestly, it just makes good sense. It saves time, it saves money, and honestly, it's really much kinder for your staff, where these projects are long and hard, and we find having a plan going in is just a much kinder way to approach it, and it does save you time and money. So we recommend you begin by really thinking about where it is you're at today as an organization and where you're going. You know, who do you need when you get there? When are you going to get there? Is this a 3-year, a 5-year? What are your goals? What are your objectives? And what kind of roadmap do you need to create to get from here to there? We assume, because you're on this call today, that that roadmap for you includes ERP. But we know under the hood of ERP it's really an exercise in people, process, and technology. So thinking about where your company is today, some of the aspects of its culture, the people, the processes, the technologies that exist within the organization, all will feed into how you approach getting from where you are today to your bigger business goals that you're trying to reach. When we talk about the planning effort from a time perspective, we recommend you allow yourself 2 months to do that. There's definitely some steps and some methodology to doing that we like to follow, but we find that it takes about 2 months to do. So that's our recommendation in that regard. When we talk about selection, this next phase of ERP, we find that it generally takes about 4 to 6 months when we do these with clients. I will say, and we talked about this in an earlier webinar this year, when clients or companies tend to do these for themselves without outside help, they tend to run closer to 5 to 9 months, sometimes can even go to a year. And that just has to do with the fact that companies don't tend to do these very often. They don't tend to have the experience because they just are such infrequent projects. And so we find we're able to help companies make these much faster for that reason. If you're interested in that conversation, there's a webinar on the user community site you're welcome to take a look at. When we talk about selection, I just really want to kind of go through the critical success factors in this context, just to kind of, again, align us and be thinking about what's important during this phase. You're going to hear me say this, boy, probably till I'm blue in the face, and you're probably tired of me saying it, and that is that, you know, once you've got your plan in place, you've got an enterprise resource strategy in place, you know, don't go into selection until you know you've got commitment from the top. This is the executive team, possibly a board of directors. You just are going to find yourself with a lot of false starts, a lot of time wasted if you don't have that commitment from the top. You have a plan in place. We talked about that. There's reasonable expectations, particularly at the leadership team, for cost, timeline, and resources. So that's some of why we've talked about what we have in the past couple of months, and we're kind of revisiting it today. That hey, selection's going to take you somewhere between 4 to 6 months, you know, maybe 6 to 9 months if you're doing it yourself, and it's going to cost this much to do ERP. A little bit of what we're talking about today, to be sure. It's going to affect your resources this way. And so, you know, when we say reasonable, what's reasonable is really unique to your company. And, you know, it's what we're saying is make sure you're having those conversations as soon as possible. You've got an experienced selection team leadership in place. Again, these are projects companies don't do very often on them. And so often we recommend outside selection leadership here, but you definitely want to have a point person in-house to partner with that person either way. Finally, you want a committed, energized, and empowered selection team. You want these guys focused on getting the job done and getting it done well. And lastly, that you've got your critical business requirements understood and prioritized. So before you do a selection, these are the things that you want, and this is the things that you want to be considering before you jump in. Next, we're going to talk about implementation. Again, critical success factors. I'm going to commitment from the top. We know what we're talking about there. Now, this is something we actually did talk about earlier in the spring. We did a three-part series on ERP readiness. And this is something that you can actually do in tandem with the selection process, but you definitely want to make sure you do it before the implementation starts. And this is just a more detailed version of once you have your plan in place and you understand where your gaps are in people, processes, and technology, you know, where are you really ready and where are you not? Where are the nooks and crannies that you really need to spend some time assessing and looking at before you actually start implementing? Sometimes you need additional people on the team. Sometimes you want to make sure you're only focusing on a couple of critical processes during the ERP implementation, and you maybe will put a couple of the less prioritized processes down to the maybe in the optimization phase, for example. So this gets to that place where you're really doing another layer of planning and understanding how ready you are to attack an ERP implementation from these three angles. Experienced project team leadership, just like software selection, you want to make sure you've got somebody internally on your core team who's been there, done that before. Again, it gets down to, we're talking about cost today, we're talking about time today, and how to save on both. This is one of those ways that you're going to be able to do that. And again, committed, energized, and empowered core team. You want the people who are doing the implementation to be allocated and focused on the effort, again, to save time, to save cost, and to really find success. One thing I didn't want to mention on this one too is 8 to 12 months. So when we talk about the timeline for implementation, again, it varies widely for all companies and always depends on the scope of the implementation. But what we generally see for a small and mid-sized company is an 8 to 12 month time frame. And lastly, the 4 phases of ERP. We talk about this last phase being optimized. So when we optimize an ERP solution, what is it we're talking about? Well, first of all, we're talking about, from a time perspective, we generally think about this as being the 12 months following the implementation. And you'll see that we kind of talk about it in a couple different ways. When we talk about it from a cost perspective today, we're going to put some numbers out there that are really over the implementation and go live phase, but also that optimize the first year and 5 years later. So we're going to cover up to 5 years when it comes to cost. But when we talk about that initial optimization, we're really thinking about kind of that initial 12 months. The kinds of things we're talking about are really that you're there to ensure solid support processes and people are in place. So post-implementation, making sure that the people that need to be in place to support the broader organization post-go-live are in place. There's this transition between your core team and the post-implementation phase where these people, some of them go back to their day jobs versus some of them need to stick around and provide support. And when we talk about later in the webinar today about costs, this will be part of the conversation, right? Who will you be able to pull internally that is already within the organization versus who might you need to add to the organization, either temporarily or permanently long-term, depending on your size of organization and your needs. You really want to continue to improve process efficiency relative to ERP during the optimized phase. During this time, you're going to dial in reports, queries, and analysis, because this is where you really start to hockey stick the return on investment for your ERP, because you're getting to the place where you can make data-driven decisions in a way that you couldn't before. Really the whole reason you have ERP at that point, or one of the main ones. Ongoing upgrades and training. So this is a little longer term optimization, probably post 12 months if we think about it. Hopefully you're not doing an upgrade in the first year, but you will have ongoing needs for training, and certainly we'll have some upgrade needs as well. And we'll talk about some of those costs at least a little bit today. When we talk about the critical success factors, again, talking about commitment from the top, same story, experienced ERP ownership. So what this is getting at is When you get to post-implementation, who owns your ERP solution? Sometimes it's IT, sometimes it's a continuous improvement team that IT works with. Sometimes this is a project management organization. We see that in our larger clients, where there's really a support team of cross-functional business analysts, technical analysts, and some IT folks all working together to support and optimize the ERP solution. But the key here is whoever's running that show for the ERP, from an ERP perspective, an enterprise application perspective, so it's probably going to be much broader than ERP itself, really want to make sure this person's got the experience to do that, both within the organization and the skills needed for things like project management and just ERP experience in general. Dedicated support resources. This is one we'll talk about a little bit more, but when we talk about the critical success factors for optimizing and post-implementation, what we mean here is, when users have trouble, do you have somebody in the organization, do they know who to call? For smaller companies, these are usually the functional, the core team members that might have gone back into the organization to play their ongoing functional role in purchasing, in order entry, or in accounting. In bigger organizations, this is going to be maybe more dedicated support resources pulled out of a day-to-day functional role, providing this guidance, so that when you're optimizing your ERP, the way to save time and cost and just a headache internally is the more you can funnel requests and issues through a single point of contact that is qualified and competent in helping the organization, guiding the organization through those changes and that optimization. That person being that main contact for your VAR long term is really going to save you a lot of time, money, and headache. And lastly, we talked about continued investment in training. Sometimes companies really, once the implementation trigger has been pulled, companies tend to sit back a little bit and not think about this area. And we find a lot of times the push to go live is so significant, and just sometimes companies come in skidding on two wheels, so to speak, going around the racetrack, that an additional round of training sometimes really is important, particularly in that first year. Okay, so with that, remember we talked about plan, select, implement, optimize. These are the 4 phases we're going to focus on today. From a cost perspective, we've talked about it today. From a timeline perspective, we'll sort of bring those 2 pieces together at the end. What I'm going to jump into next is a conversation about capital versus operating expenses. As we go along, please don't hesitate to stop with questions or comments or concerns that you might have. And we'll try and pause and take some of those questions as we go. So let's first talk about how do we define capital versus operating expenses. For some of you, this might be like the back of your hand because you're a CFO or an accounting person. For others in the organization, this may not be as straightforward. So I just want to quickly define what it is we're talking about today. So when I'm getting ready to pay for an ERP solution, enterprise solution, when we talk about a capital expense, we're talking about a cost treated as a long-term investment and charged against revenue for the period in which it is incurred. And I'm like, oh my God, how much more accounting ease could we get, right? What we're talking about here is a fixed asset, right? We're talking about a fixed asset that has value to you over time and will therefore be amortized or depreciated, if you will, at some level over a 36 to 60 month period. So it allows you to essentially defer, if you will, or spread the impact of a really big number over the life of the amortization period, to spread that impact across the income statement over multiple periods. And for many companies, this is an important thing to do. The bigger companies typically, for sure. Versus an operating expense, which is a cost that is expensed against revenue as it is incurred. So it hits the impact state, or excuse me, it impacts the income statement at the time that the cost is incurred. So generally, when we talk about who governs, the governing bodies who address how to classify ERP implementation costs from a tax and accounting perspective generally are 2 different bodies. First of all, from a tax perspective, we're all familiar with the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS. Their tax code legislates when we can take the write-off, if you will, for the depreciation or the expense, the capital expense, how we're supposed to depreciate, whether we can capitalize or expense something at the time, has tax implications. So they tend to weigh in on when that is and how we do that. Additionally, there's generally accepted accounting principles that come from the Financial Accounting Standards Board that govern day-to-day how we account for those within our books. So you need to be familiar with both. And what I would say is that over the last 15 years, the accounting rules for ERP software have been relatively stable. What shifted was in 2016 when cloud-based solutions came on board, software as a service. There needed really that change begged additional assessment and input, and so we had some additional pronouncements come out from the Financial Accounting Standards Board about whether or not cloud-based software was truly considered software. So we're going to talk about each of that. We're going to talk about first how we've historically viewed it in the traditional sense, because this is kind of the basis for some of the shifts we're seeing in the cloud-based treatment of the expenses. So let's start first with how we've traditionally thought about it. And when we talk about determining whether or not ERP software and the expenses related to the implementation can be capitalized, we're really asking ourselves first, is that software developed or acquired? And when we're talking about ERP in this day and age, it's generally acquired, but there may also be kind of adjacent development efforts going along with that. But is it acquired for internal use, meaning you're not developing the software to sell it, okay? You don't intend to market or sell it outside the company. And you need to consider the stage of the project. So depending on where you're at, will drive whether you can capitalize the expense or you need to expense it at that time. So for example, during the evaluation and selection phase, these costs, so things like the time for your employees is a great example. Maybe any demo, anytime the software partners might come on site and do demonstrations to you. You might be getting your hands on the software, but it's still just a demo. That period of time, that phase of the project, if you will, must all be expensed. The next piece is where the big stuff happens, the real big capitalization, the big costs happen, as well as the opportunity to capitalize some of these costs. And that is during the acquisition and implementation phase. And then the third phase that they weigh in on and talk about is the post-implementation phase. That optimization phase is mostly mostly expenses. So this big question we talk about is, are you purchasing the software licenses, or are you purchasing a service contract, i.e. software as a service? And so, like I said a minute ago, in 2016, FASB kind of threw us a curveball threw a curveball to companies that are considering cloud-based ERP solution. And a gray area was created a little bit around these agreements and whether or not you were purchasing software or you were purchasing a service contract. So one of the things you'll notice about the way it's been, the service contract, or excuse me, the software licensing contracts have always been written. It's been very clear that you are purchasing software for your internal use, and therefore you can capitalize that software. Well, when you start buying software and paying for it on more of a subscription basis, many of the agreements were written in a way that really intentionally did not give you license, if you will, to operate it on an internal basis in the same way. The language differed enough that it really did feel like it was a service contract. And then the minute it goes into that bucket, all of a sudden, the accounting rules behind it change, and the IRS, the way the IRS thinks about it changes as well, and we're forced to expense those costs all at one time. So the thing to be thinking about, the update that we're talking about for cloud versus purchase licenses really depends on the specific language within the contract. So in order to be deemed a purchase of software licensing, the cloud computing contracts now have to explicitly denote that the customer is that you're paying for, essentially, the transfer of a license required to operate the software. Otherwise, it's viewed as a purchase of services. So again, the transfer of license required to operate the software. It's using license language versus service language, and that's the big shift we're seeing in the contracts. If a contract is viewed as a purchase of services, then the costs have to be accounted for like any other service contract, which means all costs must be expensed when the service is performed. So the only opportunity to capitalize these expenses on the balance sheet is to book the cost as a prepaid asset and then amortize them as a prepaid or software service as the services are used. The challenge here for companies really is that being forced to expense these costs associated with purchasing and implementing the new software, it poses a significant hurdle for potential buyers of cloud computing software, because if the contract is considered a purchase of services, then you have these big implementation costs related to software can sometimes be, you know, 7 figures. They have to be expensed also. And so the potential for taking such a big and immediate hit to the income statement is just really, it's more than enough to give many companies pause when evaluating cloud software. So where you might want to do that in some respects, having to expense it all in 1 year, say, would keep a number of companies, especially bigger companies, from doing so. So many cloud software providers now have taken steps to simplify the process by moving the software service subscription fees to offering contracts based on software licensing fees. Again, we talked about how the language in the contracts has shifted from service to license language, and that has made all the difference. So the arrangement includes a software license being considered for what we call, quote, internal software or internal use software, and can therefore be accounted for as an intangible asset and therefore capitalized over time. So under the internal use software designation, the typical expense versus capitalization rules would then apply. Essentially the first 3 bullets here that we talked about would apply more like they always have over the last 15 years, and you would be in good shape to capitalize the expense. Net, at the end of the day, you want to make sure you're having these discussions with the accounting department, with the potential VAR, to make sure you're getting a hold of their contracts way early in the selection phase so that you have a sense of what their agreements are going to look like and you can make some good decisions early. And your CPA, because these rules, like I said, the changes to the cloud software, the service agreement rules came down in 2016 to augment what we've known for about the last 15 years. And so, and they're not a no-brainer to decipher sometimes. In fact, we're still seeing some gray areas in areas such as setup and configuration, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But at the end of the day, make sure you have the right players in the room and are having these conversations early, particularly in the selection phase. So once you're clear about whether you're going to be purchasing licenses or services, then you kind of have a sense of what you can capitalize, and you can use this as kind of a general guideline. Let's just walk through this for a minute to have some clarity on what you can capitalize generally versus must expense as it incurs. So software licenses. When you buy an ERP solution, you can generally capitalize the cost of those licenses. You can also generally capitalize the installation and configuration services, including the outside consulting and internal payroll costs. A way to think about this is, what we generally see companies doing is considering anything related to the initial setup and configuration, kind of maybe 50%-ish of the outside consulting, the VAR costs particularly, as installation and configuration, particularly early on, as well as the internal payroll costs of your own employees can be used to, or can be capitalized. You know, something like project management that your VAR might provide to the overall engagement is typically expensed as it is incurred and not considered a capital expense. Software development and testing. So during, you've set it up, you've configured it, and now the internal team, the outside consultants from the VAR are helping to develop, test the operation of the software. Is it working well? Is it doing its job? Any custom development would fall in this category as well. So generally, a good chunk of the time the VAR spends on the ground, as well as possibly any outside consultants you might bring in to augment your core team, business analysts, technical analysts, that time can be capitalized. The real gotcha is generally project management time. And then lastly, upgrade and enhancement. So when we start talking about optimization post-implementation, the upgrade and enhancements typically can be capitalized because they're considered, again, the acquisition of additional software for internal use. So they fall under that same sort of bucket of costs, if you will. And again, our installation, configuration, the outside consulting that goes to support that upgrade and enhancements would all be capitalized down the road. Things that are considered expensed as you go: software as a service, as we talked about, admin and overhead, including project management, data conversion and migration, training, and general consulting, again, and oversight services. We talked about the project management piece. And if you, and we'll talk about this at the very end, I've got a number of additional resources and references that I'd be happy to share with you. You can shoot, we'll give you my contact information at the end, and you can shoot me an email if that's something that's of interest to you. I was going to try real hard not to bog everybody down with, this reference and that reference. So if you want some additional kind of quick references, I'd be happy to share those with you when we're done here. So what I'd like to do now is shift gears and head toward the discussion about the costs themselves. On our way there, I want to make sure that we're aligned on what these buckets of costs are that we'll be talking about. We'll be talking about software, we'll be talking about services, and we'll be talking about infrastructure. On the software side, we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about the ERP software. We'll talk about third-party software. So this could be, well, we'll get to that in a minute, but it could be things like EDI. It could be things like shipping solutions, eShip, maybe. It could be, what else am I thinking about here? Some of our e-commerce clients will do a Shopify or a Magento integration at times, and those are some additional third-party solutions that need to be considered. And then annual maintenance, we'll have a conversation about that as well. On the services side, we're going to be talking about partner services, that's the VAR, outside consulting services, that would be for people who, actually that's like ourselves, who provide project management and additional core team expertise and augmentation to get companies over the implementation hurdle. We're going to dive even further than I think you'll see some folks do into travel expenses and contingency. On the infrastructure side, these are the types of things that we're talking about. The one thing I'll say about our time today is we don't get into the same level of detail in these areas: backbone, hardware, facilities, maintenance, DR, or disaster recovery, and business continuity, on a detailed basis as we will in the other two categories, software and services, really mostly because this is where companies differ widely and across industries. So what we'll provide is a little bit different way of thinking about and talking about those costs today versus software and services we'll cover in a little bit more detail. So when we talk about software selection, again, that second phase of an ERP implementation, let's just walk through this graphic. This is, and just a quick word about how we come up with the information that we're sharing with you today. We've been doing this a long time, and we accumulate information over time and seeing a number of proposals across the Microsoft suite of ERP. A lot of NAV. We see a lot of NAV in our industry because we support manufacturing clients. We also will run across Infor and Epicor and NetSuite and SAP. And so what we've tried to do in putting this information together for you today is try and be very conservative in the way we put the numbers together. So I think there's times when you can do this for less money. And we've tried to be real conservative because I just have a problem with, and maybe it probably comes from working with VARs, I think, on behalf of our clients a little bit, and no disrespect there at all, but they're in a competitive situation with one another, and so sometimes our clients feel like it starts out being one cost and ends up being another. And so we really want to put as much of the cost forward in how we're presenting this information today, even if we're erring on the side of being a little high, so that you just have the best the most information you can have. We just don't want there to be any surprises. That said, the reality of it is every situation is different. And so we really you need to keep this in mind as you consider your own effort. And so if you have questions when we're done here about your specific situation, you can feel free to reach out and just ask me those questions, because it will differ by individual circumstance. But my hope is that this will give you a place to start and a way to think about some of these buckets of costs in a way that'll really serve you. So from a software selection perspective, we've divided this into sort of by size of company, so small, medium, and large. And generally our SMB clients, our small, mid-sized businesses, kind of fall into this medium and large category. And when we talk about software selection, what we're saying here is that when you hire an outside resources, an outside consulting firm to help you do this process, this is what we generally see the costs to be. So on the small end, you may not seek outside counsel at all. You may do it yourself. You may not need to go through a whole big selection process if you're closer to the the under 5 million range, for example, because everybody does QuickBooks at that point because that's basically what's available. But when you start getting larger, it behooves the company to seek outside assistance in this context, because again, it's not something companies do all the time. So this is an area where we lean in, and this is what we found the cost to be over time. So hopefully this is a slide that'll serve you as you embark on possibly a selection process. So the next two slides are going to break down the ERP implementation costs for a small company. So a company maybe in the 20 million range, anywhere from maybe 5 to 30 million would be a good gauge here. And then we're going to talk about the same buckets of costs for medium-sized companies. So a company maybe in the $100 million range, and again, we'll talk about this from a license perspective. So there's a lot of data here. And I'd like to just walk through this with you for just a minute. What we've done here is you'll see the 4 columns, right? So you've got the first 2 represent the purchase of software. So this is what we call traditionally a perpetual licensing scenario. The first column representing the very traditional client server on site. I've got my own servers and I'm managing them within my own wide area network on premise. The other version is the same purchase scenario of perpetual licenses, but I'm going to have an outside company host those servers for me. I don't want to do that in-house, and now I'm going to have an outside company do that. So there's a little additional cost there. The final 2 columns refer to the software as a service, or what we might really call, leasing the software versus buying the software. And so this could be a pure cloud play like a NetSuite, or it could be more of a hosted scenario, but you're paying for it on a subscription basis. And there's a little bit of fuzziness in those categories today, because as we know in the Microsoft community, we haven't really had a pure cloud play yet. We've been sort of, either a hosted client server scenario that has, maybe they'll charge us subscription fees for, but it's not the pure cloud play maybe that a NetSuite has been, or an SAP Business by Design has been. So there's little differences there. They're all kind of coming together. The thing we're definitely seeing is that the VARs are very, very, very intentional about getting everybody moved to a subscription model, that sort of pay over time. For them, that's a better model. From a cost predictability perspective, they love that model. So we're going to see some changes there across the board. So let's just walk down the rows here. So this is an example of a small company with 15 users, and we see the software costs in this situation for 15 licenses is roughly $105,000 to purchase outright, versus, again, roughly $57,000 for the first year's subscription fees. You'll notice, of course, that the subscription fees are less for the first year, and that they accumulate over time. And so what I love to do, and we'll get down to this when you see years 1 to 5, you'll see that over time, the cost difference between the perpetual license scenario and a subscription scenario, they tend to break even about year 3 to 5, generally by about year 3. As we move down the rows, we'll see that annual maintenance, which generally runs about 20 to 22%, depending on the solution. In the Microsoft community, it's around 20%. And so that's a straight 20% on top of the perpetual license fee. You don't see that in the subscription scenario because that's included in the subscription cost, which honestly, from a simplicity perspective, is kind of handy. I know that maintenance fees are something that clients constantly are. It's a double-edged sword. You know, for the VARs, it's a necessary expense that they would argue is needed to continually maintain and update the software and provide a baseline of support, versus companies feeling like they aren't getting what they're paying for, and this big number shows up every year that can be frustrating, particularly if you spent the year not being served well by your VAR. And so I think that's another reason the VARs really love the subscription basis, is that it's all wrapped into that monthly or annual fee, and it's not such a bone of contention as well. On the third line, you see server, SQL, and installation. And what we've done here is in the perpetual scenario, we've said, hey, for the perpetual boots on the ground scenario where you're doing this in-house, we're saying, hey, every time you go to do a new ERP, we generally see our clients having to pick up a new server at that point. And we, you know, the all-in cost for SQL and the server itself and the installation is roughly about 20 grand. And you're going to see that cost show up again every 3 to 5 years. And so you'll see down there in year 5, we've popped that number up from $37,000 to $57,000, so that you can just have a representation of, hey, you know, you need to replace these servers every 3 to 5 years. If you do it sooner, back that number up into year 3. You get the idea. On the hosted side, what we see is that in general, having someone else host this scenario, they're going to pick up the server generally for you. Some companies do this a little differently, but in general, you want to plan for about $2,500 a month for a hosted solution. This would generally includes your SQL cals, as well as the server and the support, installation, et cetera. And they're going to replace that server every couple of years without you having to worry about it. And they're going to be responsible for backup and recovery and some additional things that oftentimes, particularly for a small organization, or where you're trying to run particularly lean in the IT space, this is honestly, it's a great way to go as well. The subscription or services, subscription-based model on the right 2 columns have that represented there as well. In the first scenario, the SaaS scenario, we're saying, hey, this is implied that it's a pure SaaS play versus a scenario where it might be a more of a hosted but subscription-based model, so you're going to still have those hosting fees. Versus, and truthfully, what you probably see on the SaaS side is those numbers for software would be slightly different. Oh, no, excuse me. Actually, you know what? That's not true. What we've seen actually is clients be charged an additional hosting fee by the VAR if, in fact, that's what's happening. And the software actually would remain the same. Next, let's talk about the VAR Implementation Services. As a general rule, this is traditionally, when we're talking about perpetual licenses, this is a 1 to 2 times the cost of software. And so this number is always a little tricky as we move into cloud solutions, because if we're talking about the same software, right, the annual cost of the cloud solution actually goes down, but the services shouldn't go down relative to what it is you're implementing if you're implementing the same scope of services. So you'll see where we've tried to equalize this a little bit and balance it against what we've actually seen. But you know, you want to. I always tell companies to be real conservative here, and you know, particularly if you're a manufacturing company, you want to bump this number up to probably 1.5 times for sure. If you're a highly complex industry, be even more conservative here. But we've used the 105. You'll see that's 1 time the software cost, which has also been, you know, consistent with some of the deals we've seen in the last couple of years. When we talk about outside consulting, we're talking about, again, companies like ours that provide project management, business analysts, and technical analysts to augment the core team where there may be gaps temporarily during the course of the implementation process. This actually can range anywhere from, over let's say an 8-month implementation. This can range truly from, basic project management advisory services if you've got a pretty well-rounded team, but maybe you have some gaps in some project management, to full-on, core team support and boots on the ground project management, more intense involvement. The cost here can range between about $50,000 and $250,000. So there's a big range here, and it really depends on your company's strategy for insourcing versus outsourcing temporary resources, and then migrating, which of those roles do you want to migrate to permanent internal resources. So we've given you an estimate here to play with as a starting point, but this could be a big range for most companies. The next item I put on here is travel estimates. And so on the travel side, this is one of those funny hidden costs where consulting firms sometimes will, particularly VARs, will say, our implementation services are X, and you end up being hit with a big bill for travel expenses. These guys are coming out of Toronto, or they're coming out of the East Coast when you're on the West Coast. And so asking those questions during the selection process is really important. And we find those can be a surprise for our clients. So generally, we encourage our clients to estimate around 10% of services. I think that's what I did here, roughly, maybe 20% of services. But to create a solid estimate there really makes sense. So you're not surprised by that. And then finally, contingency. The VARs oftentimes will say themselves, hey, use a 20% contingency, because what happens is during the sales cycle, everybody puts their best foot forward, we hope. As a company, organizations are putting their best foot forward, saying, this is what we know about our requirements, this is what we believe our scope is going to be. The VAR is going to respond to that with a proposal using those assumptions. And then, stuff happens. You get into the implementation and you all agree that you might need something else in that same implementation, that first round, if you will. And so things can change, things can happen. You, of course, want to manage this carefully and closely, but it's smart to have some kind of contingency in any large project that you're doing. So we recommend this, and we generally say, use 20%. It's generally a good guideline. So then below contingency, we talk about kind of year 1 versus year 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then providing a 5-year total or cost of ownership for your ERP solution. Now, when we talk about total cost of ownership, I just want you to have the perspective of realizing that we're talking about the buckets of cost for software and services related to ERP. And so you can think of this as kind of your total cost of ownership for the pieces that are here. If every company is a little different, and we'll talk about that at the very end. So maybe a couple other costs that you might want to think about, and you can decide whether you kind of put them in and consider those as your kind of total, what we call TCO, or total cost of ownership. But this gets you, definitely 80% there, if not better. So what we talk about that first year is this is where that big number is, right? This is your out-of-pocket cost. Generally, for subscription scenarios, you're going to be paying that first year's software and a good chunk of the services right out of the gates in a prepaid scenario of some sort. Generally, the implementation costs then are spread over major milestone dates if you've negotiated those properly. And that first 6 to 12 months is where you're going to see, is what we talk about year 1 being the initial costs. Years 2 through 5 depend on the model. And so you'll see in the perpetual license scenario, that number is really comprised of 2 things, and that's the annual maintenance cost, as well as for the hosted scenario, that additional $30,000 for having the hosted offsite solution. In the SaaS model, that's going to be the recurring software cost, as well as, what is that? I'm looking here real quickly. So on the hosted side, that should be the software cost plus the annual hosting solution should be what should that be, 87. I'm seeing 103. Oh, I know what that is. Pardon me. So let's talk about the, it's a small estimate for optimization. So when we get into the optimization phase, you're looking at numbers, we've tried to use, I think we've put in like 16, we have to do the math on that, but there's a small number in each of the areas for optimization. So the thing you want to make sure you're doing is each of the subsequent years, and every company is going to vary widely in how much they budget. And this gets a little bit more broadly to how you think about IT budgeting in general and ERP budgeting, but budgeting some amount of money each year, call it $20,000 a year, and go up from there depending on the size of company you are. But putting something in that bucket each year for optimization services or software, things like that, because you'll come up short if you don't. So at the end of 5 years, this is what we're seeing the costs for a 15-seat scenario. So I'm just going to take a quick pause here, just in case we have any questions. I know it can be a little bit like drinking from a fire hose, or maybe this is stuff that's real familiar to folks. I hope it's helpful to you, but want to just do a quick pause here and see if we have any questions, Lori. Anything coming up on your end?
There isn't on my end. Keep in mind you can raise your hand, everyone, and I will unmute you or type your questions in the question box. I can ask them for you.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, and so the next slide we're going to show here, and I'm not going to go through this one in as much detail. This will be one you'll have access to on your own. It's the same stuff we talked about, but it's for a medium-sized company. Everything's the same, but the licenses are about 45. The thing you want to be careful with here is in using this model. If you came to me and said, well, I'm also a $100 million company, but we need like 75 licenses, the relative cost difference for the software isn't necessarily going to peg out exactly relative. And so if you've got a little different scenario like that, I'd say, give me a holler or talk to the VAR that you're working with to maybe give you an estimate directly, and just make sure that they're calling out all of these costs, or where all of these costs are represented in the proposal you're being given. Because there's things like when you get up to those number of licenses there's different license types. You're going to find higher discounting the more licenses you buy, and things like that. So just keep that in mind, that it may not be a relative bump just because you've got 75 licenses, that everything goes up exactly that way. And this is a quick summary here. I want to provide just a quick summary. This sometimes can be helpful to kind of bring everything together. When we talk about ERP costs and timeline, and we bring them together, plan, select, implement, and optimize, remember we said that planning is about 2 months, selection about 6 months, implementation somewhere between 8 and 12, and then optimize is that first 12 months after implementation. So when you start thinking about, like, when do I budget, when do I start, who do I need to get involved, and when do I need the money, etc., you start backing up from thinking about, well, when, based on my business requirements and the needs within the organization, do I have an existing ERP that maybe is going to be sunset or at the end of life, and I have to do something, and I know this is going to happen out in the future sometime, and you start backing up from there, you can make some pretty good assumptions and estimates about when you need to start the planning process, when you need to have the money for the implementation. And so I hope this will serve you in that way. When we put the cost numbers in here, I kind of tend to use worst case scenario sometimes. This is the purchase license hosted scenario. So the costs are bumped up a little bit to represent the hosted scenario. And then the costs in the optimized bucket here represent more of a 5-year pull than that first 12 months. So from a elapsed time, we're talking 12 months, but from a cost perspective, we've tried to say, hey, this is kind of that over a 5-year period. And then finally, that total estimate comes out to, almost $1 million over 5 years. This is the medium sized. I should mention that as well. I don't see it on the slide, that it's the medium sized company in this context. Okay. So I hope that serves you. So as we, before we wrap up our time, I wanted to just talk about a couple other costs that you want to be thinking about as you go through this process. So experienced project leadership. If you go way back to when we first started, we talked about this in the context of software selection. We talked about this in software selection. This is that situation where companies so rarely select ERP solutions that it really is a small amount to pay in the big scheme of things to manage the risk of failure in selecting the wrong product, or taking a great deal of time to do so if you are under a time constraint. Making sure if you don't have that experienced leadership in-house that you outsource that, and considering that cost within the software selection time frame, this would be one of those costs that you think about. Can you get some of it internally? Do you need all of it external? This is just, we talked about it a lot today in the buckets, but sometimes that can bring an additional cost into some of the phases that you may need that you may not have planned for already. Third-party software and services, we mentioned it briefly in the context of our ERP costs, but this can vary widely, as I mentioned, I think before. So just make sure, and when you're dealing with ERP, sometimes these, the contracts and the numbers, everything ranges. If you've got a lot of different players that you're talking to and that are in the room or in the mix when you're doing the ERP selection, there could be a lot of contracts, a lot of partners, a lot of data floating around. So, finding a good tool and being aware of asking all those questions that we looked at in that ERP cost, the detailed chart. Even when it comes to third-party software, it's kind of that same conversation. You want to make sure you're really detailing that out in much the same way. We didn't include any costs in that regard in our model because they do vary so widely, but you do want to make sure you're accounting for those also. Additional internal resources, again, go back to the planning phase. Where do you have gaps? And that's part of the reason that outside consulting number ranges so much. We, again, put 75,000 or so in there, and something slightly bigger probably for the medium company, but that's a number that can range wildly as well. This is something we didn't talk about yet, and that's financing the purchase, which, by the way, the interest you can capitalize along with the software cost. And so financing the purchase is strategically a really interesting way for some companies to address paying for the software. And so when you run the numbers, some companies will find the benefit to not only being able to capitalize that number over time, but being able to have someone, if you will, borrowing the money to do the implementation, to finance the implementation costs can really be a really great use of, a really great way to manage your own cash flow as well. We see this model used for our small, fast-growing startups, so companies in that kind of $10 to $20 million space that are growing rapidly, that financing the purchase for them, not only can they depreciate the cost and take capitalize it over time, amortize it over time, but by kind of getting somebody else to provide the capital and paying for that over time really helps them manage their cash flow and get some additional benefits. And lastly, one final slide, and this is because it varies so wildly that when we were talking about what will ERP cost you, we didn't spend a lot of time on the infrastructure costs from an internal perspective, right? We talked about hosting, but beyond that, we didn't spend a whole lot of time on it because this just varies so wildly. Gartner Group does a really great job of providing benchmark analytics for IT spend as a percentage of revenue and by industry. And we love this industry data because, for one, it's been relatively stable for years. So you'll see the number here is from 14. That's because the numbers just haven't changed that much, that they haven't even put out a new version because of that. And we find the industry numbers tend to be pretty accurate. And so a lot of times the interesting conversation we have is when we go into a company and, again, this will vary for you. So if you're in food and beverage, maybe, when we go in on an ERP, a new ERP for a large, maybe a family-owned food and beverage company that's never done ERP, they'll look at me like I have three heads when I say that IT spend is 1.3% on average of revenue for their industry because they've never spent that before. Well, they've had a really stable legacy system for 30 years, and the same guy running the AS400 box, and now they have to modernize that. And so that's a really, this is a conversation we like to have early, even if they don't spend 1.3, just to have them understand that the way the cost and the spend is going to differ. Because this IT spend generally includes your ERP stack as well in the way companies think about it. It also includes all of the infrastructure pieces also. So this is something that I like to show because it really kind of brings together the ERP costs, the software, the services that were talked about today, but it also kind of pulls in that IT spend on the infrastructure side as well and brings it all together so you have a little more of a complete picture for your industry. So with that, what I'd like to do is just open up the floodgates here. And sometimes on the webinars, honestly, we don't have a lot of questions. We process and talk through a lot of things. And there aren't always a ton of questions, but we really want to make sure you have the time for a few minutes here. If you had any questions, just pop those up quickly. And if not, you're welcome to contact me afterwards, and I'll give you some information on how to do that here in just a minute. Throw that up there just for a second.
Yeah, thank you. There's your contact information there on the bottom. Appreciate that.
Yeah. And while we're waiting for some questions to come in or give people an opportunity to do that, I'll say a couple things. We actually have an ERP cost estimator that was kind of the basis, the tool we use with our clients to develop some of the models you saw here. If that's something that you're curious about or want to talk about, just shoot me an email. You can give me a call too. My actual phone number's on the next slide. I'll show you in a minute. But feel free to just give me a call. I'm happy to share that with you, even talk through it with you if that'll serve you. And then I think our next webinar is how to create more capacity without adding people. That's at the end of May. You'll see that in the user community feeds that you subscribe to. And then finally, just when you get that survey from Lori today or tomorrow, which if you could just take a minute and fill it out, that just serves our ability to serve you so much better. So we'd love your feedback. And then through the end of April, and actually I think I have no problem extending this into May, frankly, because we've pushed our some of our webinars out. Super happy to extend this into May. And that's just, if you want to have a conversation about how to do some of this initial enterprise planning, we'd be happy to schedule 45 minutes with you to do that. That's something that I think we can add a lot of value for you. I'm happy to do that with the user group communities as we happen, although we're not a VAR, have a lot of experience with the Microsoft products because we see them a lot for the companies that we serve. So be happy to spend a little time with you if that would serve you. You can contact me via email below or via that phone number there as well.
Thank you, Erin. We don't have any questions at this time, but I'll just give it another moment or two. As Erin shared, the survey will be coming here as soon as I close this GoToWebinar, so you'll get it immediately. And we would like you to complete that. In the comment section, too, let us know if there's any other webinars that you would like to for us to host. And there's lots of topics out there. So if you're looking for something and you're just wanting to hear from a subject matter expert, let us know, and we will find somebody to deliver that. And Erin, as always, thanks again.
That's great. Oh, thanks a lot, Lori. So again, any questions or comments, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, folks, thanks for your time today. I hope it was valuable, and hopefully we'll see you again at the end of May.
Yes, we have over 75 registered for that so far, so there'll be a lot on that call. Yes, take care, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day, and bye for now.